Good evening, and a really, really warm welcome to what I know is going to be a wonderful event, Macquarie Business School's Leadership Series, tonight with the topic of From Nudge to Boost, New Directions in Behavioural Science for Government and Business. So my name's Leonie Tickle. I have the privilege of being the Executive Dean of the Macquarie Business School, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all tonight and to see so many faces, old and new, here among our students, industry partners, alumni and academics. So a really warm welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this evening. For thousands of years, this place has been a site of knowledge sharing, and it's that same desire to understand, innovate, and create positive change that brings us all together for this conversation tonight. So tonight we're asking an ambitious question. How can we take the powerful ideas of behavioural science, nudges, boosts, and beyond, and apply them to create meaningful system-wide change? And we're really privileged to have Professor David Halpern, CBE, an eminent authority on this topic, here as our keynote speaker tonight. And later he'll be joined by an absolutely stellar panel of experts, including the Honourable Victor Dominello, Dr. Juliette Tobias-Webb, and Professor Maroš Servátka, moderated by Professor David Orsmond, to explore how behavioural science can transform government, business, and emerging technologies. So, before we begin, let's do a little behavioural science experiment. It seems only right to kick off the session. So, I'm going to ask you a few questions. All that's required is to be honest and to raise some kind of indicator for me. So, first, raise your hand if you'd accept a free $500 right now. Excellent. This is a business school session. We would have been worried if we hadn't got that right. Excellent. Okay, so now raise your hand if you'd rather wait 1 year and get $600 instead of $500. We have a few very disciplined financial thinkers here, including some of our panel, who know all the tricks, but obviously most of their hands went down. So this is one little indicator of what might seem like illogical decision-making. $600 in 1 year probably is worth more in a present value than $500 today. We don't rate it that way. So that's present bias. As humans, we tend to rate more highly immediate rewards than waiting a bit longer for something that might serve us better in the end. Let's try another one. And I had this exact scenario last week. Imagine you've bought a $100 ticket to a concert. Actually, I'm out of date, aren't I? I think it's probably more like $250 to a ticket. I don't know. But on the night, you're really tired and you don't feel like going. Which of you would still go to the show anyway because you've paid for the ticket? I went. So again, this is the sunk cost fallacy. When we let past investments drive our future decisions, despite knowing we're not going to get our time back, we're not going to get our money back. So I think these are just a few very simple examples of behavioural science in action and why decision-making, even among most of us here, doesn't always proceed in what we might perceive as a logical way. And it's these issues that behavioural science seeks to understand and harness. And tonight we're going to push that conversation further, so beyond one-off nudges towards system-level change and thinking about how government, business, society more generally can benefit from the good design and governance of these kinds of tools, and in an age of AI, how emerging technologies might influence that. So to help us explore these really fascinating issues, it's my honour to welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Professor David Halpern, CBE. David's extraordinary career spans decades of leadership in academia, government and research. As the founding CEO of the UK's Behavioural Insights team, better known as the Nudge Unit, David advised at the highest levels of government on strategy, wellbeing and behaviour change. He's authored influential books, including Inside the Nudge Unit and The Hidden Wealth of Nations, helping to shape how organisations think about human behaviour and decision-making. Now serving as President Emeritus of the Behavioural Insights team and as Director of the Downing-Babcock Institute at Cambridge, David continues to bridge academic research and real-world policy, helping governments and organisations around the world use behavioural science to create meaningful, lasting outcomes. Please join me in giving a really warm welcome to Professor David Halpern.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. So yes, I'm going to try and run through quite a lot, see how we do. And it's partly a rehearsal of a book, actually, which I'm finishing at the moment with a colleague. So what am I going to try and cover? A quick bit of background for those who don't know it. The Behavioural Insights team, I'm President Emeritus now, which I think means I occasionally get to cut a ribbon, some version of that. And do some other stuff. But none of this, my whole team, there's Alex over there who leads the team in Australia, but done a huge amount in many countries, actually, heading for about 80 odd countries, nearly 2,000 projects, etc., across many administrations. Yes, I'm, this is the team there, but in case you don't know them, some of them are in the room, you just say hi. And now, as you said, actually, I'm spending a bit of time. I used to talk about being a recovering academic from Cambridge. I was tenured a long time ago before I started to work for, actually, Tony Blair. It possibly means I'm now a relapsed academic, I suppose. Anyway, being back some time to try and figure out, can we get, the key policymakers on key issues together ahead of the cycle and figure out what we might do. Today, I'm just going to briefly cover through then, for those who don't know anything about behavioural science, hopefully most of you in the room do, but very, very brief history indeed about some of that. Then I'm going to focus particularly on this argument around so-called updating economics, which is this puzzle that a lot of the key foundational elements of economics look like they're being knocked away, and it's strange then that economic policy hasn't changed that much, if that's the case. So a few examples of that, and then I'll rehearse this argument about nudging to boosting. For those who don't know what it is, hopefully you will do at the end of this, and at least be able to blag it. So very brief introduction on the behavioural science stuff. This kind of core argument, often particularly linked to Nobel Prize winner Danny Kahneman, thinking fast and slow, that most of our decisions that drive our behaviour are actually done by automatic, intuitive, very fast brains about, shall I eat that donut, shall I not? Wasn't a careful, reflective process. Versus, systems two, as it's sometimes known, which is something reflective, deliberate, you're really trying to work out the cost-benefit analysis type thing, which a lot of policy is premised on presuming that's what people do. And as we know, that they do sometimes, but they often do not. And these shortcuts, even though they work very well, often are prone to error, and you just rehearsed a couple of them as you went. Everyday examples, this is there's a million of them now, but why does it matter? We ask people how many calories does a burger have, and they give you an estimate. You ask another group exactly the same burger, but the salad is next to it, and you can see, and magically, forget laws of physics, it has fewer calories, which we all know obviously is true. If we add the salad, then there will be less calories. You can see why it is, because you're doing some kind of averaging. You can also see why it's problematic as to whether we might all eat too much. Behavioural insights are being applied to very, very wide range of areas now in many, many countries. There's hardly a policy issue you can't think of, and of course most policy issues concern human behaviour, be it, we'll talk a bit about consumers and finance, but crime, will people obey the law, will they not? Education skills, well-being, etc. In many of these areas, what's very striking is that behavioural and lifestyle factors are, in fact, the dominant cause. So health, in fact, is a very clear example where the majority of years of healthy life lost are known behavioural and lifestyle factors, and yet that is not where we spend our effort. We spend our effort on very expensive secondary care, and we do remarkably little in terms of the primary drivers. And most people in government sort of know this, and yet we kind of carry on anyway. So having said, the implication of this behavioural science had quite a few cut-throughs, but actually you can flip it around. Your half-empty version is we've hardly begun. We're hardly scratching the surface in terms of the implied reorientation in a number of areas. For BIT, the history, because governments have long since thought about behaviour, at least to some point. When I worked for Tony Blair, you used it. We did some of the early work, for example, on auto-enrolment, which we later introduced. But it actually didn't politically work especially well. The White House started to use it, particularly from 2009, when Cass Sunstein went in to work for the president, and we looked at that very closely. In the UK, it particularly picked off in 2010 with the coalition government, Cameron and Clegg. And in the coalition agreement was this phrase, which was to be the raison d'etre of why we were creating the team, that our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. And it was partly juxtaposed as being, it was a centre-right government in the sense of we were trying to reduce the size of government, and this is to some extent an alternative to passing a law or another regulation. And I'll come back to the wording of that later, because you'll notice the breadth of it to enable people to make better choices for themselves, which is actually a stronger ambition than what looks like a nudge. There were lots of other things I should say behind that. The 2008 financial crisis was a really important driver for us and a number of other governments where financial models appeared to be, and economic models were mispredicting. And one of the interesting things which actually runs through this a little bit is that, I mean, for us, I think a number of international institutions, there was a couple of years probably of wringing of hands and what we should do. And then there was like, oh, bugger it, we'll just go back to the models because they kind of worked well enough and maybe it was an anomaly. And is that good enough? I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but if you were going to learn anything, you do want to do a PhD, you don't want to read inside the nudge unit, you can just try and remember this very simple mnemonic. If you want to affect human behaviour, make it easy, make it attractive, look at the social influence, what's everyone else doing, and timely, when the key moments. And it's sort of painfully obvious, but then you look at a lot of policy and practice and you find that that's not what we do. We don't make it easy to do lots of things we want people to do, and it may not be attractive in some sense other than even the narrowly financial, etc. There are lots of examples, including Australia. This was a classic one from years ago. I'm not going to go through hundreds of studies, but it was an elegant illustration of it, which is you may remember this one, but parking enforcement order. By the way, people read these things often. They're written by very clever people like Martin and the people who work for him, written in legal language and so on, and people literally don't even understand what you're asking me. Nor is it clear what the demand is. And so if this was a very simple trial, could we rewrite it? Tens of thousands of people getting these enforcement orders, they're not paying, and then you've got further action, and in some cases they might even lose their license, etc. This is it's like, do you really need a PhD on this? But yes, it turns out you do. So enforcement, or what are you asking me? And what are you asking me to do? Turns out, pay now, right? Just make it easy, be clear, what's the request, etc. And then, hey presto, does it make a difference? Yes, you get significantly additional pay, fines paid by a given date, and so on and so on. My memory of this one was even the paper saving was $80,000 and not having to send further letters, which is an indication of the scale of it. It was these many simple applications which also help governments across the world get interested in this. Like you could just use it, if you could just alter a few letters and get these improvements. One in the UK was prompting people who are late paying their tax, adding an extra line or two, just with an extra line saying most people pay their tax on time, social norm. You're one of the few yet to do so, led to basically a 5 percentage point or 15% increase in the payment rate without further prompts. And that helped a very sceptical civil service to think, well, this is pretty useful stuff, isn't it? And of course used in many other areas too. By the way, of course this is evolved in lots of ways. One of the things, because it's done these days, is you don't even have to run the trial. Sometimes you can use, in this case, this is an AI prediction of where people will look and the primary messages they will get, let alone what we can do now. And you can immediately see, is the message getting across over there? Probably not. Here it is. Now, this has spread widely across the world. Faisal used to be at OECD, regularly does this update. This was his one from about a year ago, more than 600 nudge units, so-called around the world. So there's quite a lot of them. Okay, that's all very good. So we could talk more about that. There's lots of fantastic successes. I said auto-enrollment, and we did the sugar levy, and we got lots of sugar out of drinks and lots of other things in many places across the world. And some of these trials now are absolutely massive. I'm supposed to not apparently talk about them, but some of them are actually gobsmackingly huge trials operating in some countries at the moment. But one of the puzzles that certainly bothered me, and it bothered Richard Thaler too, was that for all these great successes, and indeed literally a list of Nobel Prizes, including now Richard, of course, Richard Thaler, is knocking out a lot of the key foundations of economics. Despite we often talk behavioural economics, is that economics, let's say economic policy, didn't seem to have changed very much. There's some micro applications like auto-enrollment and so on, but there seemed to be a lot of other things where it would raise questions about. So I'm now going to I'll just rattle through some illustrations of this, and this is based loosely on a seminar that Richard and I did in Downing Street with the new government in Britain shortly after it was appointed, including with the basically Council of Economic Advisors. And you can read more about it. There's a paper, Fixing the Holes in Economics. And then I'm going to switch into this argument about boosting and why, hopefully, which is subject of the upcoming book. So there are lots of examples. I'm just going to use a few of them to drive home the point. So one of the simple everyday ones is so-called sentiment effect, which Bob Schiller, again, another Nobel, has made a big point about the importance of these epidemics of popular narratives, and they drive a lot of economic behaviour. So if you revisiting the literature to work out the effect sizes, I mean, for the US, roughly about 20% of growth, it looks like it's pure sentiment-based, which is quite a lot, really, given what else we'll try and do for a 20% extra on our growth rate. One thing that people always have in mind for sentiment is the sort of, the tulip bubble, or, of course, Australia had its very own with respect to nickel prices, and you see this massive surge, and then it goes back to where it was at the start. But there's something slightly misleading about these bubbles, because sentiment effects don't necessarily take you back to zero. And in fact, often sentiment effects, what they do is they operate as a coordinating mechanism in the economy, because if I think, well, things are going to get better, and then, well, we should all go and do a course here and learn about business studies, or we should invest in more machinery, is effectively it synchronizes the economy, and you don't return to zero, you return it to a different point. So particularly on the upward sync. We can also see sentiment effects operating the other direction, which is if you talk down an economy. And arguably, those can be larger, partly because everybody's always talking up the economy. So if you get senior figures who talk it down, you're like, oh my God, it must really be senior. And then, of course, you can have it operating in the reverse. I won't dwell on it, but for those who follow UK politics, this was quite a striking feature of our incoming administration, which made a very strong point about the fact that how bad it all was, and the deep depth of a hole. And it's like there are pretty clear indications that literally suppressed economic activity, whether it was politically right or not. And we see it in many areas, of course, in terms of what happens with sentiment. But at the very least, it's like, well, I don't know what it is over here, but if you're running a treasury and you've got a few thousand people or your business department, and then a minister might have a comms person or two, but if sentiment effects are this large, it shouldn't just be on the side, it should be pretty fundamental. We do see in some domains, like in central bankers have got the message, and it's been well documented, it's the sentiment, the words which they use have significant market effects over and above the actual formal decisions of the rates. But the question is, what else would you do? And I think there's actually potentially quite a lot. I leave it hanging. So that's one, sentiment effects. Let's go through a few others. This is one which actually Richard is particularly keen on, fungibility. So everyday speak, the presumption is a dollar, right? It doesn't matter who gave it to you, right? It's the same thing. And it's an amazing thing. It makes economic models much simpler because of the presumption of that, the fungibility, it's sort of in and out. As Richard said, and one of the things about this and other areas, because I said another Nobel, but is that economic models have got more and more sophisticated and clever, but consumers seem to decidedly remain kind of human. So whose behaviour we're trying to model? So fungibility, that sounds quite a technical issue, but again, I'm going to use an example from recent UK government, and forgive me for that, but which is that, let me just say, Treasury, most departments, in my experience across the world, particularly when you get a new minister come in, they have a stack of things they've long wanted to do. And then when the minister asks for ideas, particularly about cuts, it's like, well, here's one we prepared earlier, minister. So, a few of you nodding, you know that well. And often there was a reason why you didn't do it. But one of them where there really was a case for is this argument about we have this thing called a winter fuel allowance, which may or may not make sense over here in this climate. But in Britain, I guess cold in winter. So Gordon Brown introduced this thing a number of years ago, which is several £100s extra for anybody over sort of 60, you get this extra money. And there was a long argument, it was pretty inefficient because it's not very progressive, and there's no point giving it to Martin here because he doesn't really need the money, and so on and so on. So you'd be better off just putting the money up on pensions, and then you could be more progressive about it. And another thing we thought was that why give it in cash form? There were questions about could we do it in some other way, but you get the gist of it. So the Treasury this is pretty inefficient. Let's just get rid of this stupid winter fuel allowance. We'll just put some extra money on pensions and right with those who need it. Which makes perfect sense. It just doesn't work that way with humans. So it happens to be a very beautiful illustration. So Rachel made this announcement because she felt under enormous Chancellor pressure to say, we're serious, we're going to make cuts. And so this was a pretty obvious one the Treasury said you should go for, a few billion quid. But we had this thing, I'll explain it in a second. So we can use what's called a discontinuity design, and you can look at people who are just one side or the other of a threshold, right? So if you're just about to turn 60 but you haven't got it, or you just had it a week ago, you're basically the same kind of person, right? And so you can match by household. And then you can look at what happens. So this was done as a discontinuity design quite a few years ago, before the current fuel crisis, I should say. And so how much did people spend in those households on fuel overall with their budgets? It was about 3%. So if we give you a few hundred quid extra, assuming you're reasonably rational, what would be a reasonable estimate is, well, you might spend about 3% of it because you're spending it on other stuff, right? But this discontinuity design, so the actual expenditure was 47%. So giving people this extra money with a label on it saying winter fuel allowance means they spent a whole load of it on winter fuel. Who'd know? So then you turn along saying very rationally, this is doesn't make any sense, we're putting your pension, we're going to take this thing away. A lot of people got really, really angry. And genuinely, I think Treasury economists were scratching their head like, what's the problem here, right? What's wrong with you people? Like, it's the same. But of course, it's not the same if fungibility isn't applied. Various other ones quickly. Preference inconsistency. Oh, economics would be so neat if we could, we just utility maximizers. But the problem is, well, which version of our utility do we maximize? Both in terms of our predictions may be wrong, but also that they literally change over quite short runs. Lots of studies of this. I'll just give you one old famous classic one, just to drive home the point. This is an old study of Danish workers, so maybe you wouldn't believe it over here, but where, for those who don't remember it, you win a competition. It's very nice, fantastic, congratulations. So David, you've won a good job. What would you like? And you get a choice of prize, which is either a kind of bowl of nice fresh fruit you can have. By the way, it's going to be delivered next week, I should make clear. So which do you want to have? Fresh fruit, or do you want to have some chocolate? Well, 3/4 of those win for a week forward. Say they actually choose the fruit, right? That's our future self. I should be healthy, etc. Guy turns up, said, a week later, really sorry, David. You got your prize, but we've lost your paperwork. What is it you said you wanted? Guess what? 3/4 of the people now say chocolate. Not only that, it even depends whether it's before or after your lunch as to whether you give that answer. So if you've already eaten your lunch, then you might go for the fruit, but otherwise, definitely the chocolate. So it's like, well, this preference inconsistency turns out to be a really serious issue with respect to what you're trying to optimize. And I'll come back to that later. Are we irrationally cooperative? That's another issue. So, of course, this is Ostrom, amazing work about actually people seem to cooperate remarkably well around commons, much better than thought. And she documented in her team literally thousands and thousands of these examples where people do seem able to cooperate and collaborate pretty well. And that is not really what a lot of economic models presume, especially things like the ultimatum game, beloved of many economists and some psychologists too. This, by the way, is a picture of Joe Henrich. So the ultimatum game, how many economists, you basically, okay, some are shaking your head. You get some version, lots of versions of it. You basically hear some money, for example, and you're going to divide it between a receiver, one's giving it or not, and what do you do with your dollar? And if you've been trained in economics, of course, the answer is, as long as I get some money, if I'm receiving it, I should say yes. Even if you just say, you're going to keep 99 cents, I'm going to get 1. I should still accept it. My one power is to reject it, and neither of us get anything. So because my utility is improved, because 1 cent is still better than none, but we know, basically, there's only 2 populations in the world who've shown any behavior which is close to the predicted economic model. One is trained economists, that's what the answer is supposed to be. But in normal populations, that is definitely not. Across the world, you almost always see people, won't accept less than 25% and generally want more like 40% or they'll reject. The only other exception is, this is Joe Henrich who studied it, is there are some very tribes in the middle of nowhere who have had no contact with market economies, where actually, interestingly, they do fit with the prediction of the economic model. It has much wider impacts, particularly around things like social trust. So do we think other people can be trusted? It's a really powerful predictor of all kinds of things, including economic growth. This is actually percent of people who say most people can be trusted across countries, and that's GDP per capita. And obviously that's just a simple correlation, but when you build it in various kind of models, we find it's pretty predictive of actual economic growth. We find it's predictive at individual level, at group level. By the way, here's Australia. pretty well, actually, on social trust. Certainly a lot better than America these days. It's been going down fast. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to be a political joke. It's just factually true. It's been true for a while. But it's a really significant asset. You know, if you live in an economy where you think most others can be trusted, it means information flows better. It massively lowers your transaction costs. You don't need a lawyer every time you do a deal, right? You can just say, well, let's just agree. And it also has implications, for example, in the labour market. So who do you employ for a job? If you're in a low trust equilibrium, you employ your cousin or someone that you know already. And if you're in a high trust equilibrium, like Australia, you go and run a competition and you get the best person for the job. You can see why that's consequential. Social trust has never featured in, I can tell you, any British Treasury model ever. And yet it's a better predictor, for example, than levels of educational attainment, human capital, but it's not in our models. I'm not sure it's in your models either. Last one before we get on, shrouding. So this is David Laverton. He hasn't got a Nobel Prize yet, so feeling left out. But this shrouded attribute is one which is kind of normally considered to be hidden in some way, normally by a firm, where it could near costlessly be revealed. And does that matter? Well, it matters a lot in many, many areas. And I'll talk quite a bit about this. This is a study actually we did in Australia a few years ago, Alex reminded me, which is greenwashing. You know, many consumers say, well, I want to choose a green product, but how would we tell if it's a green product? So these were just sort of, they're mock-ups of different firms that people see, they're sort of made-up firms, and you're asked to kind of rate, you know, how green do you think it is, or you know a bit about them. Basically, you just need to put a picture of a bit of a tree anywhere or greenery, and people think it's green. It is shockingly effective, greenwashing. Not only that, I'll tell you, even more shocking is, do you think it would work better or worse with people who actually care about the environment, right? You're going to look more carefully. No, it turns out people who care a lot about green issues, greenwashing is 2.6 more times effective than people who don't, right? Which is like, oh my God, well, what do we do? So now you're a company which is genuinely trying to do something green out there, but like you're hitting these, your competitors just need to put a picture of a tree on it and they'll be just fine, thank you very much. Why bother with that carbon stuff? So pretty consequential. Why does it matter really? I mean, deeply, is that I think it has lots of other impacts, shrouding problems, because, I mean, this is my view, and you don't have to agree with it, but let me put it provocatively, and at least one other person I think on the panel may agree with this, is one of the puzzles, certainly for classical models, is why? Look, if I'm making sort of widgets, and Martin here's got a more efficient widget-making company, well, it's pretty obvious. Well, the investment should shift to him, right? And the consumers should shift him, because either be a better product or a cheaper product. And also the workers, why are they still with me? Go and work for Martin. But we see this incredible stickiness and persistence even within sectors of this long tail of low productivity. And some particular manifestations, one documented, is the rise of zombie companies across economies. Now, partly that was cheap money, but it's not only cheap money. Like, why isn't the market clearing and getting rid of them? Or the other end is choice. Why wouldn't more consumers use choice? Or in the UK, it'd be Which, or in America, Consumer Reports. In all those countries, a lot less than 1% of the population use these things. That may not be very consequential for you, but for some consumers, it's really consequential as to whether you're buying a product which will last a bit longer or not. But basically what most people do is, you know, they borrow it from someone else if they can, normally their grandmother if they're in Britain, and they don't buy it. Why not, given the impacts? All right, so there's quite a lot of these puzzles, I think have a lot of implications, and I'll just try and, under this framework of one of our objectives is to not least move from nudging to so-called boosting, and this book which will be out hopefully end of this year with a colleague of mine, Liz Costa. And why I think it has an extra edge, I should say, is that I think in a lot of places people feel they are done to, both sometimes by government, sometimes by companies. And so the bigger ambition, I said, when you look back at that phrasing when we were setting up the Behavioural Insights team, which was not just to prompt people, nudge them, as it were, to make a better choice, right, a better decision, but to help them be a better decision maker. Right, that's the bigger ambition. So auto-enrollment, you know, famous example, because New Zealand did it too, and so on. Incredibly effective. 91% of people stick with the default. We've been spending literally, well, hundreds of billions of dollars, actually, certainly if you include the US and elsewhere, on tax subsidies, but it turns out changing the default so people opt out rather than opt in is breathtakingly effective. But you might say, but we didn't make you a better decision maker, but we got the right decision. So why does it matter? And I'll try and run that argument. So boosting is generally about this sort of thing. So a lot of conclusions of nudge. Sendell Mullinathon, some often refers to this as everything you need to know about behavioural science in one slide. So that's it's a famous actual image, the fitness centre. You you get people in by putting this short escalator to get you there. Or you wouldn't work up a sweat going up the steps to get your gym. But on the other hand, it's arguably pretty effective. And we end up doing things like that to sort of nudge people or design the choice architecture. And it's sort of funny, but it's like a bit depressing too. Surely you just want to if you're a better decision maker, you're going to run up those steps. So this argument, nudges often use anchors, default, social proof, these various things we talk about. And some of them are actually what are called educative nudges. But the idea of boosts is things which are essentially prompting you normally of a moment of reflection to make a better decision. And I'll try and illustrate this. It has two. One is about the individual, but one is about the field effects. What does it look like? So here's an everyday example we all know well across the world. We recognize this scene, a happy family scene of everybody on their smart devices. Go to any restaurant if you aren't, it's out and about. The numbers, of course, are stunning, particularly from 2012. Roughly, if you take your average Western country, you'll move from about 3 hours on screen to about double that in the wake of 2012. And a lot of people, of course, we've been trained, we've been addicted. It's attentional capture. What do you do about it? How would we break it? You pick up your phone because you're meaning to, in Britain, you check the weather. I know over here, what's the point, right? But, you were meaning to check something, and then after half an hour, you put your phone down like, what was that I meant to do, right? So one argument, and this is a classic sort of what we now call a boost, is you try and break that cycle in some way. So there's an example developed by some psychologists in Europe, particularly linked to Ralph Hartwig, which is called 1 sec. And the idea is you put it on your phone. It is quite annoying, I should warn you before you do it. And so you choose which apps you want to get more control over. So it might be social media, etc. And then when you click on it, it tells you how many hours you spent on or how many minutes yesterday. And then it makes you wait. By default, I think it's 6 seconds. You can get it down to 3 seconds. But even 3 seconds is really annoying if you're used to doing this. Does it work? Oh, it's spectacular. So on all age groups, including teenagers, by the way, it more than halves social media use when you put this on your phone. And you can see why. It's because it just kicks you into reflecting, did I really want to do that? And after 3 seconds or more, you're like, okay, maybe I'll talk to my wife. Which, of course, I'm happy to do. Right. You can see, so we would call this a boost. Effectively, it kicks your system 2 back into action instead of an automatic loop. So lots of these things. There's a whole class of them, particularly linked to so-called commitment devices, which when we make a prior commitment, and we'll say we'll do this thing. Again, it violates fungibility, but people often seem to do this also to deal with their preference inconsistency. There's loads more we could do this around. One thing I've long felt we could do much more on rainy day savings, despite we spend these billions and billions on pensions. But most countries haven't created a sidecar equivalent with respect to rainy day saving, which certainly for low-income groups would be a sensible thing to do. But key to it is also then getting the friction right. So it can't be instant, right? Because it can't be change your mind straight away. Oh, yeah, I'm out, I'm drunk, I want to do this thing. So a simple thing would you'd have a delay on it. So what is it? Is it a couple of days, 3 days? You can decide. But you voluntarily put friction in. And you can imagine you might also voluntarily in other ways. We try to get some banks to do this. So they don't want to have lots of hassle. So it might be that when you're signing up, you have to choose between various options. You might do it, I'm saving for my kids, so you have a little picture of your kids, and if you don't put money in, it degrades. That works pretty well in other contexts. Or it might be that you have to write out, 10 times in full, no, I don't really care about my kids anyway. You could have chosen it before yourself. Or the one I also wanted to try, which is you should choose a couple of people who get a text or a WhatsApp when you try and take the money out. Obviously, it would probably be your mother, or it can't be your mate because they'll collude. So it has to be someone, probably a workmate, who you don't like very much. But whatever, So they're going to call up and say, what were you doing? I thought you were saving it. Okay, so those are examples. But a deeper form of boost, I'll just give you one before we move on to system ones, which illustrate this effect. So I don't know if some of you know this. This was the very sad, inspiring case for what drove Chicago to create what was the crime lab and then later the kind of the urban lab. And for those who know Chicago, it's a very racially divided city, but generally the sort of two halves are stayed apart, very wealthy university, but away from some pretty rough areas. This young man, Amanda Sis, was a PhD student who had just done his Viva. He was due to graduate from Chicago, and he'd just come out of the library. He had a bag on his back, and a actually a teenager, 17-year-old, approaches him, someone else, and says, give me your bag, whatever. There was some kind of brief scuffle, and the teenager shoots him, and he dies, right on the steps outside the library. There was nothing except a couple of books and like a water bottle. So he probably just misunderstood what was going on and didn't give it straight away. So, from classic incentive model, well, what would have made a difference? As happens, this young guy who did it, Demetrius Warren, was given 120 years eventually for murder. So, would it have made a difference? He was given 200 years, right? It's not in that moment, would it? It's quite hard to think of a nudge which at that moment would have made a difference with respect to his behaviour. So this becomes the deeper puzzle about what's going on. But if you try and understand these kids in detail, what's going on, a lot of it is very impetuous, basically. And so this led to the programme, some of you may have heard of it, I don't know, it's called Becoming a Man. Has anyone heard of Becoming a Man, this programme? If you're nodding there. But I should say, he wasn't in the programme. He was visiting as Obama. So what they do is these kids who've been brought up in a tough neighbourhood, and they have learnt that, if someone says to you, give me your lunch, give me your sandwiches, if you don't push back hard, the next day they'll say, give me your phone, the day after that, give me your dollars, right? So it's kind of rational in the world they live, which is to react quite strongly and violently. But it then becomes overgeneralized as a response. So these kids are, of course, teenagers have become quite scary in lots of ways. So the Becoming a Man program was like, well, can you break into that loop? So I'll just give you one example of the opening things they do with this guy, an ex-gang leader. So they get the kids, well, young men you can see, into pairs, and they give one of them like a tennis ball, right? So we give you the tennis ball, right? And we give it your pair together. And then the challenge would be, okay, great, get the ball. You can imagine how this plays out, right? Yeah, punching, scrapping, rolling around on the floor. And then they switch over to it the other way around, right? Anyway, you get the gist of it. So great, eventually like, calm down, all right, if no one's got anything too broken, let's have a discussion. So what they do is they say, so you remember you had the ball, so let's talk to you. Why didn't you just ask for it? Well, it almost never happens. Why don't you ask for it? And then they normally say something like, well, I couldn't do that. You think I was a punk, right, or whatever. I was, So, okay, that's interesting. What would have happened if he just asked you for the ball? Guess what? Exactly. That's what they nearly all say. Like, what do I care about this stupid ball? Just give it to him, right? So why is it you're trying to reset people, and particularly, essentially, you're training what we call a form of CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, is when you feel that rising anger, you try and stop it. Is there an alternative to going, completely nuclear? In fact, the kids nicknamed it Control-Alt-Shift. Like you remember you used to do on a PC? It's like, this thing's misbehaving, like just press these keys, like just stop it, okay, right. And that's what they called it, like get a control of your emotions in those moments. It's effective, like really effective. 2 RCTs showed more than a halving in subsequent violence and arrests and so on of these kids. So we wouldn't call that a nudge. That is what I think we would now call individual level boost, right? So the key thing I just want to make as we move on, right, is that we naturally often think of, because we're weird, as to say in the technical sense, Western educated, etc., of this as individual changes. But many of the most powerful boosts are actually in the context, right? They're in the environmental context. So let me just show you a few examples as we and then we'll get to the close. So a key issue in many areas, like is financial literacy. What can be more to help on financial literacy? These programs work a little bit, but they don't work very well. It's a funny place to say it, business school. But even people who've gone to a business school turn out to make lots of the same errors which we see in wider populations and so on. So it does help a bit, and of course you have a certain level of knowledge. But in contrast, interventions around legibility are really effective often. So this was an old trial we ran around Forex trading, quite a few years ago now, but we asked people basically to choose. I see a number of examples of, currency exchange, which one's the best value, you choose it. In a kind of bog standard format, which is like, here's the exchange rate, blah, 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 less than half of people could get the right answer. And we just varied slightly the transparency, because what is the commission included, is it not? And as you dial up the kind of, just for clarity, if you like, the comparability, guess what? Then large, clear majorities become able to answer these. This simulation at the end, by the way, was a so-called current market or mixed model. Because you think, well, if we set it up so that some of them are really clear and some of them are not, well, how will people do? No, their performance collapses back to pretty much as bad as it was before. My main point is, and we see lots of examples of this, where legibility of the environment is transformative. I'll just give you another example. I didn't put a slide up on it, but you know the famous example of flying fortresses in the water? You know this one where they kept crashing? You know this story? Yeah, it's really neat. Very sad. Hundreds and hundreds of them kept crashing. They're literally gone to hell and back. And then when they're coming into land, the pilots don't put down the landing gear. It's like, oh my God, these guys, incredible pilots, and then they just destroyed it. It kept happening. And it was called human error. If you know the story, or somebody's nodding, is again, it's a legibility problem. So the controls of this incredible craft kind of look the same. So they grabbed this, put the wheels down, but they didn't actually put the wheels down. They'd actually moved the flap. So what can you do? Is it just file error? No, they redesigned. It's a very famous early example of ergonomics, which is you change the control for the wheels to put a wheel on it. And the one with the flap, which has a flap on it. And then basically you stop crashing planes. The point about it is the boost is in fact in the environmental context. So this is true for lots of areas. And a lot of this, because sometimes when you have these discussion policies, like, oh, well, it's just information asymmetry or whatever. It's a lot more than information asymmetry. It's often an active confuseology. This is a nice one, imports and exports. For European Union, if you've got electrical products, you'll see this mark on it, the CE, Conforme Européenne. My wife could say that better than me. But some products don't. But if they're coming from China, they often have this on it these days, which looks strangely similar, but it just means China export. So, that's obviously not an accident. You're using it in order to kind of introduce deliberate confusion. Some here. Victor, of course you recognise this one. So an obvious thing to do is create better transparency. Number one, with price. Can you even tell the difference? Can we inform consumers? Can we improve the market functioning? So that's a pretty good thing to do. But often we also don't only want price, we want quality if we can. So a simple everyday example is you're going somewhere else, what restaurant to go to. We're all very used to the idea of we use a star rating in some form, right? There's a beautiful paper actually by Mike Luca, nearly a decade old now. But why it's neat is it does a causal analysis of the impact of a star rating. And you'll see why I'm dwelling on it for a minute, which is this is giving the ability, of course, to learn from other people's experience. So it turns out the causal effect, this is in the early days with Yelp, of having one extra star, right? And we can talk about why it is. It's very neat design. It's causal. It raises your turnover in the year following for the restaurant by 5 to 9%, right? It's causal effect. In fact, we know more detail about it since Mike's study, which is it particularly raises the turnover of the best restaurants, and the effect is half the size, but it reduces on the worst ones. You see what I mean? And what's happening there is that, because the overall sector gets bigger, therefore. So it's squeezing at this end, but really widening at this end. You become more able to go out and eat because you know you're going to get a decent meal. So that's a pretty big deal if you start shifting it. And we use some of those models to work out, well, imagine you do the equivalent deshrouding in other parts of the economy, and you get that sort of effect size. What does it do? Well, by the way, I just say it roughly doubles your productivity growth rate if you do it for other sectors. Because what you're doing, you're accelerating the growth rate of your better products and company, right? Why wouldn't we do it more widely? And in other areas. This is one which I thought kind of relevant for this context and more generally, but this is actually a few years ago. How else would you deshroud in other areas? So this was done by, actually, of all people, a public health group who did it with 15-year-olds. We did a smaller scale thing in this in Australia, actually, a few years ago. But asking young people about when they're using different social media platforms, how does it affect them? So if it's going to the right, it's a positive effect. I can't move the mic, but it's like self-expression, community building, awareness, etc. This is YouTube. Bad for your sleep. Everything's bad for your sleep in these because they scroll, right? So you stay awake at night. But in contrast, if you look at this as Instagram, there are loads of negatives in 15-year-olds. Not just sleep, but anxiety, depression, loneliness, body image, blah, 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 fear of missing out. So, you can put this together and you can start to say, well, actually, what's the ranking? This was done, I said, a few years ago for a few of them. YouTube, at least is somewhat unbalanced. Better, but YouTube is really not the same as Instagram. So YouTube doesn't make you feel like utter crap if you are a 15-year-old girl, whereas Instagram categorically did. So the odd thing to me is why weren't governments then running this again and again to shape markets? So this is a really powerful tool. We call it, you don't pick winners, but you can pick races, right? That's what you can do in many areas. We don't build cars, but we can have NCAP ratings, which we know discernibly alter enough consumers to reshape markets. And I'm very struck, actually, as I troop around the world, is this sort of sense of we can't do anything about tech giants or these big companies. Actually, there's loads you can do, particularly ones which have got a very highly invested brand. It doesn't take, if the good people of New South Wales find that, the wheels keep falling off Bentleys, it's pretty bad for Bentleys everywhere, pretty fast, right? Now, obviously, it's a kind of close to close. One of the key issues we're all wrestling with is AI. Is AI the ultimate boost, or as Steve Jobs called it with the computer, the bicycle of the mind? Well, if that was the bicycle of the mind, this is like the mega electric rocket of the mind. Is it that? Or is it actually going to be a bad thing? And we're wrestling with it. And it's completely able to be both those things. What's the right race if we're training AI beyond the narrow run? And people like Mustafa Suleyman, you may know from DeepMind and now Microsoft, I think correctly are saying, we can build the technology, but you've got to figure out what the race is. And particularly, he's talking about, well, is it going to increase your well-being? Actually, you mentioned, when we were setting up the Behavioural Insights team, one of the key things then Prime Minister Cameron was extremely interested in was well-being and happiness. And we did very serious work on it. It politically actually didn't run very well and eventually was dialed down a bit. But we've got to revisit it, right? What are we training for? As I mentioned, people are already preference inconsistent, so it's not a trivial matter at all. This is just a summary, by the way, of a lot of the things that drive actually objective well-being. Let's just say measured by life satisfaction would be a classic measure. This is happiness, but and some of this stuff is obvious. Health problems on the negative end, right? Bad health, not great for your well-being, etc. Being unemployed, really bad, and the much larger effects than the income effects. What's AI going to do for that, by the way, in terms of our etc. etc. But look at the top end. You look at this top variable is actually social support. That is basically the question. If you're in trouble, is there someone who would help you, right? Is there someone who would support you? Someone would bring you chicken soup type questions if you were sick. Really massive effects on our well-being, and also fits with the social support one I said earlier. Freedom to make life choices, etc. Income's in there, thank goodness, more income. But it's like, well, do we think we're building products which are going to do that? I mean, is our AI going to say to us, really nice to see you again, David, but don't you think you should call your mother? Actually, for me, it doesn't work, but or etc. Is it going to make you prompts to make you wiser in your judgments and so on? And if not, why not? Have we built that race? Having frankly been behind the curve with respect to social media, where we didn't build the race right, well, are we going to build the race right with AI? It's absolute all for grabs. So, in conclusion, I think I was trying to say, for those who don't know, Keynes' famous quote. He said, that basically treasuries and so on were full of people following long-dead economists, who now, of course, include him. Interestingly, this madman scribblers. A common thread, I think, through a lot of this stuff is that there's a presumption. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of the individual level. We know that we're not Spock, we're not the super rational utility maximizers, but we're also not quite Homer Simpson. We could be something else. But also there's this presumption in the Chicago model, which you see quite strongly absorbed in many places, and Treasury still, you can decide about here, is this presumption that markets are the best place to solve these informational problems and cooperation. And that seems to be, there's quite big question marks about that. There are lots of other policy levers which we could use and we do not use adequately. And I think one of the things that gets in the way of my increasing view is that we are stuck on some prior models about believing the Chicago model still, despite all those Nobels. So we need to move basically, yes, from nudging to boosting is one of those things, and I think there's quite popular demand for doing so, essentially restating agency, bringing agency back in a what would that mean for our citizens and our people. And the final thing I just mentioned is that, I kind of dwell on it, but particularly when you think about well-being, is a lot of these things rest on collective choices, social media being a classic example where, when you say to young people, what would you pay in many countries, and what would we have to pay you, to get off social media, and they say, $50, $100. But then you say, if we could get rid of it completely, then what? And they say, well, I'll pay you for that. It'd be interesting as to where people in Australia still think that in a few months' time, but that was the experimental evidence. So the question becomes, well, is it between Australian government and Mike Zuckerberg to set the conditions, or why don't your users, right? When you get together and you have these discussions and reach a consensus statement, is it possible? So this was actually some work we did literally with Meta across, more than 30 countries and multiple languages, where participants were asked, well, what do you think the behavior should be of AI agents on our platforms, right? They may not be experts about AI, but they are experts about their own life, about how they want other people to respond. And they come with quite coherent suggestions. And one of the interventions that could be used by more governments is say, well, if we're not going to regulate, what we are going to do is say, have you got a governance mechanism where your users set the conditions rather than you, Mark Zuckerberg, right? That would look like a pretty good boost. Right, I should stop there. Taken, too long probably, but thank you all. Here you go.
Well, thank you very much, David. And what a tour de force amongst this topic. And you can see why David is such an expert in the area. Could we just give another round of applause to David? Thank you for that aspect there. So my name is David Orsmond. I'm a professor of economics here. So I'm going to be the guy champion economics on the panel up here with my colleague as well, who'll join me later. I'm actually relatively new to academia. I've only been there about 6 years or so, having spent a long time in government departments and policy-making institutions, in particular in the Prime Minister's Department, the IMF and the Reserve Bank. And in all those institutions, particularly the Prime Minister's Department and the IMF, the issue was really how do we go about thinking about a problem and then designing a set of incentives where the stakeholders would buy into that because there was something in it for the stakeholders that matched the goals that we were deciding we were trying to get them to achieve, and which were then going to be durable. Once they started down that behaviour, they weren't just going to give up in a year's time or so forth. And so as you were talking, David, I was really thinking back on these challenges that I always found as I was trying to think about how does one make good policy? What do we mean by that? In particular, how do we work out what somebody even wants? What is utility maximising for an individual? Whose goals are we trying to get them to conform to? Which I think is a big question in today's political environment. And then how do we make sure that these things actually last so that we're not just 5 minutes of sunshine and go in from there? So we have assembled a terrific panel to sort of explore those questions along with David, and I'll just introduce them all now. So maybe the panel could come up. I'll sit at the end here, but they sit anyway. Oh, great. Thank you very much for turning that off, Kuch. And so just running from the furthest from me, David, of course, you already know. Victor Dominello, I'm sure everyone in this room knows Victor from there, for the former New South Wales Minister for Customer Service and Digital. And Victor, let me tell you that I was just in Service New South Wales recently, and they're still performing brilliantly after all your changes that you introduced from there. Currently the CEO of the Future Government Institute, works with the World Bank on how to come up with national digital strategies, former director on the Tech Council, and so forth and so on. The advertisement said that Nathaniel Spencer was going to join us. She unfortunately was not able to join tonight due to a family situation at the last minute, but she very kindly, I don't know whether the right word is lent on or encouraged or somewhat, a colleague of hers, and it's just fabulous to have Juliette Tobias-Webb with us. Juliette has worked extensively on experimental psychology. In fact, she has a PhD in that from Cambridge. She's an adjunct professor in the AI and cyber futures role, and she works now as a consultant, particularly with CEOs, thinking about these behavioural science issues and how they can play out. I noticed from your CV you're also the director of the Kindness Factory, which just sounds so great. You've got to weave that in somehow or other about what you do and perhaps how behavioural aspects come into that. Finally, closest to me is my great friend and colleague is Maroš Servátka. Maroš is also a professor of economics at Macquarie, and he's the founding director of Macquarie's experimental lab, where he goes around finding these poor, unsuspecting students and saying, let's actually do an experiment on you. They do get paid for it. How do you think about these issues? And then what do we learn about the world, about how people actually act? And I think he's going to bring in some aspects of that as well. Of course, he does a lot of consulting and work in a variety of different areas. So with that as a preamble, I don't know, I'll probably just ask my first question, then come and sit from over here. The way I'm going to run this is sort of to talk a bit about those aspects that I introduced at the beginning, and then we'll obviously turn to Q&A, wrapping up here a bit after 7:30 or thereabouts. Why don't we start, I guess in the order that I introduced the three of you. This is such a huge topic, and David's put so many topics on the table. I think it's probably a good idea if we start for each of you just to talk a bit about your thoughts and insights in this area. In particular, what do we get wrong about behaviour, or what do we get, if you like, you can put it more positively, what do we get right about shaping and disciplining people's behaviour? And what do policymakers need to think more about in this aspect from there? It's a very open question. Take it any way you like from there. But I just want to make sure we all have a chance to say, well, what do you think about this area? What have you learned from this? Victor, let's start there.
I don't think we think about it enough, to be honest, inside of government. It's very niche. We tend to use blunt instruments inside of government, legislation, and then we work out the consequences of it. And then you get people like Behavioural Insights team to come in and say, let's see how we improve that. I assume everyone here is from New South Wales. So you'd remember the COVID stimulus vouchers. Again, that was just an idea that came up in the middle of the pandemic, and we were trying to get the economy moving really, really fast. We could have done a couple of things, which a lot of governments around the world were doing. Here's some money, go and spend it. Ideally spend it in this area. But we did something very novel, and I think first of its kind in the world. We said, all right, that beautiful Service New South Wales app, just click a couple of buttons and you're going to get a QR voucher on your phone. And again, what we saw behaviourally after that was extraordinary. Like, people weren't just spending the $25. For every $100 that was on their phone, they were then digging into their pocket and spending $220. So, the multiplier effect of that. But if we designed that with Behavioural Insights at the beginning, and I went to Treasury and said, we can get you a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 return, it would have been a much easier path to Treasury. But, we had to use a pandemic to force them. But again, if we use this type of thinking, because we weren't thinking about it that way, then Treasury around the world would say, 3-to-1, we can leverage the power of the people, the consumer, to dig into their own pockets. Where do you get that return? So I don't think we think enough about it.
But that's because you're essentially directing them into those particular activities and lowering the price.
Yes, correct.
And so you're deciding the activities that you think are worthy, you being the minister,
Yep.
or the
We said,
policy
here's some
maker,
active kids
and then
vouchers.
saying these ones we want to direct you in and we'll lower the price on those.
Yeah, so for example, in relation to Dine and Discover vouchers, we were desperate because the shops were struggling at the time. Here's $25, but there were a whole lot of touch points. Do we give people $100, but then they'll go and spend it at once, or do we give them 4 lots of 25? Because where is the point where they'll put their hand in their pocket for extra? And we're finding they weren't just spending the 25; they were then going and spending, again, in this case, it would have been $42.50. But that doesn't include the taxi to the venue. It doesn't include the cappuccino afterwards or the gelato in the shop next door. It was a massive multiplier.
Juliette, what do you think on this?
For me, I think it's coming back to I'm preaching to a room of converts here, but at the same time, I think we still blame ourselves a lot for our decisions rather thinking about how the environment shapes it. So if I can give an example, I did my PhD looking at why we gamble when the house always wins. And it is an industry that has harnessed human psychology to shift your thinking and behaviour very quickly as soon as you enter the environment. And in that case, it is full of nudges in ways but the end outcome is that the customer loses, the house always wins. And so by virtue of that, they're not sort of shifting who we are as individuals. They're not necessarily shifting the education, they're shifting the environment. So if we can harness some of those insights in order to help people get better outcomes and in order to help them win. So, and look, maybe the example here is there are some situations where it is ambiguous around what is the right choice. You can surface a select number of choices that might be useful and help people. And I think with the virtue of technology now, what you can do is help people come back to those choices at a number of occasions where they might change their minds. But it is that piece of how do we continue to tap into the environment to be able to change outcomes. So maybe I'll give you a better example, because I like what came from here is I often use the cockpit as an example, right? So it's a perfect example of how the aviation industry over 40 years has redesigned the cockpit in order to make the sky one of the safest places to be in the world, because it designed for humans and redesigned the environment, realising that there'll always be somebody that's up till 2 a.m. that has, got distracted or whatever that might be. And by virtue of that, they've also reimagined that collaboration between humans and machines now, where it's a team. So the AI, which we'll sort of talk about and get to, but brings that objective, fast information that corrects for biases that often humans have, and humans bring that care, context and judgment required to fly the plane. And that sort of, I think we often will still, even as very seasoned behavioural scientists or behavioural economists, will come back to thinking there's something that we can do, or so there's something about us or others that is causing their decisions, rather than coming back to what might we want to do to change the cockpit, so to speak.
Yeah, I must say, as a frequent traveller, I was very encouraged to hear David's comment that there are pictures of the wheels down, as I'm sure many of you would have felt the same way. Maroš.
I'll sort of, in my answer, I'll combine what you guys mentioned, and that is, economics gives us a very good framework that tells us about what people are going to do, how they're going to respond. But in its essence, those are things that we know people are going to do less of something that costs more, and they're going to, if you sort of increase the benefits, they will try to do a little bit more of that. The environment, however, complicates things. Okay, we sometimes these benefits are not clearly visible. Sometimes there are other complications. Sometimes there are things that we don't even recognize that are inhibitors within the environment. And so one way to find out what people do is to actually test what they do. And you'd be surprised how little people are interested in actually testing that. And this comes from the governments, comes from politicians who often don't want to find out because they have to explain to their constituents that they did something that didn't work, didn't have the impact that they wanted to. Managers and companies and executives, they don't want to explain to their shareholders that something didn't work, and so they prefer not to test things. And so then they act based on assumptions, based on what they think is going to happen. And so to sort of convince them of how little we know, I give them an example of myself, right? So I'm an experimental economist. I've been conducting experiments for over 25 years now. And I actually, when I started thinking about this, how to convince people to experiment and to try what works and what doesn't, I actually went through my experiments that I ran one by one, and I tried to figure out what was my success rate in terms of predicting what people are going to do, right? Again, this is something that I do professionally, and that I do, it's my main part of my job. The success rate that I have in terms of predicting what people do in experiments that I set up, right, and where I test what I think is going to happen, is below 40%. So now imagine if you are trying to predict what people are going to do in a very complex environment that you don't really understand, right? It's likely less than that. So we know very little about how people are going to respond, and there's only one way to find out.
Yeah, run more experimental labs and keep you employed for life, I guess, is the answer on that one. So David, coming back to you then, how do we handle this problem that we think we know what people want and how they're motivated and their behaviour, but if you take Maroš's point, in fact, we, as just people thinking about other people's problems, are not very good at predicting it. So how do we really know that on any nudge we're doing, we're actually maximising utility?
Well, we know some. I mean, some are relatively robust effects, anchoring effects and so on. But to reinforce the kind of a last point, one of the effects I've over recent years become more and more sort of think is pivotal, particularly for policymakers, is what's known as the illusion of explanatory depth. So, I mean, humans have a certain superpower, which is we learn from each other. It's a remarkable thing, and it helps explain our extraordinary success as a species. But we're not as good at it as we think we are, knowing what other people think or what they're going to do. And that's true in general. So for those who don't know, this is kind of experiment. You ask people to explain an everyday thing that they're familiar with. How does it work? The classic example is, how does the toilet work, right? And everybody like, well, I know how the toilet works. You have used it every day. How many times? Fine. So you explain to me, how does the toilet work? And you get people to write it down. And then after a little while, people generally realize, I have no idea how a toilet works. Right? But you might say, well, so what? But they think that they do. In fact, even worse than that is if people think that if you give them an exposure to something, they learn how to do it. They even learn how to task, which is even more. In fact, on aeroplanes, you know, there's studies where you get to, you said, do you think you can land a plane? And most people rightly say no, unless they're a pilot. So then they get shown a short video, 4 minutes, of someone landing a plane. A key detail, by the way, is you never even see the pilot's hands. And then you ask people, do you think you could land a plane? And then large numbers will say, yeah, I reckon a pretty good shot. So it's even worse. Not only we mispredict how well we'll do. So it's quite problematic, and it's applied also into a prediction of our own behaviour, so the utility function. That's one of the things where we talk about, it seems an obvious thing, let's design the race. Well, let's make sure AI or social media makes us happier, but we're not very good at knowing what increases our utility, and particularly in the short term when we respond moment by moment. It's not what we seem to say when we're thinking about our future selves. So that's why I feel like it's, and for lots of reasons, but actually we need to return to that quite decisively to unpack that function, because if we don't, it's going to be done to you just as happened with social media, right? So our first step is to understand what we don't know about ourselves, right, in order to then do the equivalent of the making a plane safe. It's like we need to do the same for our utility to understand ourselves better. And that's partly we can learn, of course, from other people's experiences, why it seems a trivial matter in some ways to get these feedback loops in an economy, but it's actually giving you a version of your future experience which you can learn from.
Yeah, exactly. So that's at the individual level, but then, Victor, your example that you were saying raises a really interesting question about saying that what happens when there's a disconnect between what's actually good for the individual and what's actually good for the society? So your goal was to say, we don't have enough demand, we're in the middle of COVID, we need more demand, let's go and encourage them with vouchers that they're time dated, so they're going to lose them. Who says that's good for the individuals? Maybe if the economy turns south, they will have spent all their money going out and suddenly find that, in fact, that was a bad idea to go out and use those vouchers and spend all the extra money. It was good for the government because you're trying to think about how to encourage demand and whatever.
But
you don't pay for all the extras that you point in, the multiplier effect, as you put it from there.
No, we didn't factor that in.
And so
at the
how
time.
does that then end up where can be this disconnects between what the government would ultimately like us to do, but actually what may be best for the individual given the uncertainties or whatever. Bank runs is an obvious example of this. You advise people, don't go to the bank, don't take your money out, it's all fine. But actually it's logical as an individual, go and take your money out as fast as you can.
True. Choice.
So how do we end up with these?
Give people agency, give people choice. We didn't say you must go and spend it. We said, here it is. And we made it easy, a couple of taps on your phone and you get it in. But to go back to a previous point you raised, it wasn't a uniform adoption. And in fact, I remember getting grilled in estimates over it. How come this region, the adoption rate of the vouchers is X, and over here it's Y? And it wasn't like a statistical variation irrelevant, of 2 points. Like there was 10 points. So we then had to do deep dives into why is this hypothetical Wagga Wagga only adopting at say 60%, whereas in Albury, it's 82. Yeah. What is the groupthink in Wagga Wagga that we are not understanding? Why is there a slow adoption rate? And this is why I think it's the main point I was trying to make previously is governments don't institutionalise this type of thinking. Right. Imagine if we had that and it's institutionalised. It's not an afterthought. We actually put this into the design architecture of policy delivery. Then if we're doing something else, we can say there is a problem here in Wagga Wagga that we need to adjust for environmentally because they are not absorbing that demand as, say, Albury. So what are the other interventions we need to do for X, Y, and Z? Again, the efficiencies and in terms of service delivery and optimising outcomes would be just profound if we institutionalise this rather than, there's a problem, now get the BIT involved.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Linking into exactly that, in fact, all of the answers so far link in, and it's something, David, you mentioned before. There's a lot of reliance on trust by the decision makers in this whole broad area. The idea that the decision makers is essentially benevolent and trying to think about what's right for the society as a whole and trying to think about what's right for the individuals within it, and then designing systems that go on from that aspect. But what happens if can we really rely on the decision makers, who are ultimately sitting back as politicians and whatever, to actually be trusted, to be trustworthy in designing these sorts of systems? I realise this is a very difficult question, but I think it really gets to the heart of where we are today, as I mentioned in my opening comments. How do we think about that? Because if this area is going to go forward as more nudges and more issues, then we're going to need even more trust in our decision makers. And yet if you just look at the trust metrics, it's all going back in the other way, where people are becoming less trustworthy of expertise, less trustworthy of decision makers. And yet the whole system, it seems to me at least, has trust in the decision system at the absolute core, before you even get to the design of the policies and whether it's utility maximising, whatever. Juliette, do you want to start on that aspect and see, and we'll go to Maroš?
Yeah, I would say from a business perspective, you are seeing that companies are leaning into looking at trust more from things like building, transparency builds trust, sort of the research around that from Ryan Buell. You're seeing now, like Wise, which used to be TransferWise, they're all around operational transparency. There's a lot of companies looking at how to cue trust in the right time. I'd say, from a CEO and executive level, it's interesting because it's more of a period where they're also now going back to experimentation to some extent with the rate of change and the rate of technology that's coming. And so I would say that this is not experimental, not evidence-based kind of way, but they're coming back to, for them, what do usually customers buy into in terms of trust, and that is what their vision and their values are and how that feeds through. So if I can give an example of MasterCard, is they are a digital and very innovative focused company but like to give priceless experiences. So they're building their trust through priceless experiences that they're building. A little bit different from, I think, many of the other perspectives here, but that trust piece is still we're looking for those cues in the environment. That's changing when it's coming to who do we trust and how do we build that trust. But from an organisational level, they're also thinking through that, but they're often coming back from what I'd call their infrastructure or their backbone to guide that, then building sort of some of these behavioural science principles around it. So if it is that operational transparency piece, depending on, but they're also looking for.
But then we had the experience that David brought out of the greenwashing, which is trust bought on the cheap, because there's no real aspect. But David, let me just go back to you on how do you see this trust question going and the current environment where, as I say, people are just becoming less trustworthy of the decisions made by experts?
I mean, you're partly political class, but also more generally. I mean, one of the key things about trust, right, is that, as you do a lot of work with Bob Putnam, is the argument is ideally trust is based on trustworthiness, right, as a really key detail. So, I mean, not least if you think about, business school, whatever, many might actually be in the business community, do you feel confident if you produce a good product or a better company, will it win the race, right? Will it, because it's more trustworthy? And what I'm saying is, I personally think one of this massive lacuna is governments have held back from that because they think markets clear well enough. You can massively improve them. Let me just give you a real example. So, Amazon, from Amazon, but Amazon was an amazing company, I think, for a number of years. It lowered delivery costs. It made lots of small companies able to operate in lots of places. Of course, you get rent-seeking, which is built over time, monopoly issues. But another thing that also happens is, of course, Amazon, companies pay Amazon to get higher in the rankings as well, right? It's not just Google, etc. It's not a public number. Our estimate from an old White House colleague, he thinks this year or last year, Amazon got $70 billion, at least, in the US context, from companies paying to be higher in the rankings. Which, by the way, think about that. That makes the rankings less useful. They're less trustworthy because it's not driven by where it is, right? Yes. It was in a really important form of inshittification, which is stopping your economy working well because you can't make these trustworthy judgments, right? So we should lean into, how do we make it easier to tell the difference? And I think there are lots of examples of it you follow, or even, I mentioned choice. I mean, I think, by the way, Victor is one of the few ministers who ever seem to deeply get this, why you might want to lean into this space. But, it may not matter to you as to whether which washing machine you get. If you're a low-income individual, that's a really key choice as to whether is it worth spending an extra $100 for a slightly better one. Right, so if you believe and you're trying to make the market function better, why wouldn't government just say, can we just do a bulk subscription, please, for choice? Anybody who's low income, anybody on benefits, let's do it. What would it cost to get, the marginal cost is almost nothing, right? Yep. not only to help people on low incomes make better choice, who are often under great financial pressure and mentally tunneling as well, but it also makes your economy work better, right? Because your better products and services then take market share. But the point about it is it's not just abstract trust, it's based on trustworthiness about what's the better product or not. And the market, we too often have presumed will solve it, because the argument will be, well, if it's a market failure, then someone else will figure it out. It's like, no, there are loads of these widespread failures which are slowing our growth, not only economic growth, but actually on other dimensions too.
So doesn't the AI issue, which you touched, David, at the end of your discussion, doesn't this just add these challenges on steroids? In the sense that we now have the AI that's going to go about trying to work out at least some aspects of people's prediction, some aspects of people's characteristics, and then predict on that. We're giving someone the control to actually let the algorithm run. We have no idea about how the algorithm actually comes up with its predictions, because they're just complete black boxes. And yet we're thinking we can bring this into sort of the nudge aspect and learn more about people and go in from there. And we have this environment of declining trust. So how do we square what looks like a very round circle in these things? Maroš?
Well, I'll come back first to the issue of trust, which I actually spent a big chunk of my career studying, because it's just a fascinating thing in a market economy, right? Where do we get the trust? I grew up in communism, and I always kind of wondered why some markets were more effective than others, or the central planners that we had, and which led me to study economics at the end. And the really nice story that really emerges really gets back to the original debate between the sort of neoclassical economics and behavioral economics, and how do you kind of how do you reconcile the difference between these two? And I'll start with the history of Roman Empire. In 1985, there was this behavioral workshop where Vernon Smith, who was in neoclassical economics, was on one side of things, and then you had Danny Kahneman and Richard Taylor and George Lovenstein on the other side, and they were sort of debating how come people sometimes make mistakes and sometimes they do not. And Vernon's point of view was that it's all about the institutions, right, that you build. And so if you have the right institutions, the markets are going to operate properly. And the essential features of these markets are give people the ability to learn, whether from their own mistakes or from the mistakes of others. So the transparency now becomes very, very important. And then make it easy also to learn and allow for some sort of repetition, right? And then people will start behaving as if they were fully rational. And sometimes they might not even know that they are behaving that way, but people act in their own interest, and so they will do. And so now this is more of a challenge also for the regulators, where the transparency is an absolutely crucial feature, right? Governments have essential role in the functioning of markets. They can act as adjudicators, as referees, who are there and who actually really help set the rules in this case. And so this is yet another challenge that we have, where the regulation obviously is going to be hard to keep up with the development of AI, right? But this is something that we should really strive for as societies, because that has the potential to increase trust, improve the performance of markets. And if it doesn't, right, we're going to see a massive tanking of these markets, of the functioning. And so those are pretty much the crucial points here.
And Victor, how do you see this whole AI fitting into the nudge environment, or just generally quality of government decisions?
It's really challenging, like particularly with the agentic age. Everyone's going to have a Jarvis or 2 or 3 Jarvises. Yeah. So I'm struggling to trust you, let alone your bot. And particularly if the bot is being nudged or is nudging you. It's just, the world is getting so complicated. As David said, it's about being trustworthy. At the Future Government Institute, we've created a framework about what trustworthy is. It's SPRITE: security, privacy, resilience, inclusion, transparency, and ethics. And if I can just go back to I think the superpower in the AI age is transparency, not just to find out what's in the black box and how they're making decisions, but transparency in terms of the market, particularly if in the future, we're going to get bots just going in and saying, yeah, thumbs up, I write these reviews. Then it's just going to be very noisy. I want to know that if there are 20 reviews, they are from real people that have not been manipulated. So how do we get to that? I was with the ACCC this morning, and I think everyone in the ACCC should be wearing a cape in the back of their back, because they are superheroes, because they are literally the personification of sun in the market, transparency. Where there is a challenge with the ACCC is in Spain and in Korea, governments can actually go in there, or through the regulator, through the institution, and say, you know what, we think you should be demanding this new data to open it up to the public. So, for example, in New South Wales, we've got a thing called Fuel Check, one of the things that David and I bonded on initially. And Fuel Check, before Fuel Check, which is basically demanding that every petrol station, the 2,000, report in real time on an app, the price as they go up and down in real time. Before Fuel Check, there was this wretched thing called, informed sources. And what it was that basically the oil cartels were sharing market prices between themselves. And the ACCC, it wasn't even an offence, it's a criminal offence now, but they were getting away with blue murder. So we introduced Fuel Check. They whinged and screamed saying, don't you force us to open up to the market. But when we did, huge adoption rates, blah, blah, blah. What we need is more of that. And it doesn't need to come from government. It should be coming from an institution, a regulator, like they do in Spain, to say, you know what, here is a problem here, and the market's flooded with crap in through AIs or the bots or whatever it is. We're demanding now that this now gets exposed. We're demanding that the market provide choices, because I think that level of transparency will improve trust, probably more than anything else. In an AI age.
I think that's a really great, I'll get to questions in just a few moments, but I think that's a really great point on where this comes. If nudge is going to be a successful way in which we continue to develop it and go, transparency of the goals of the decision maker, transparency of the way that we're coming up with the information and so forth is going to be an absolutely essential part. Now, hopefully that transparency is truthful, but ultimately, there's a contested political process. Juliette, would you say the same thing for companies? I mean, this greenwashing thing really makes me worried, because people just tend to quickly they think they're being transparent, but really they know they're not.
Yeah, so I think that AI and any of the tech capabilities, it's a tool. So it depends on the people running the company and the decisions that they're making, right? So what I mean by this is, I think about now with AI, you can help surface the right decisions for people. So if we take the Amazon example, they now are able to not just tell sort of what you're doing right now, but what your next choice is likely to be. And they do that in order to ship products to distribution centres near you so that you get it within 24 hours, so you have like a frictionless experience. Now, we could use we could use that AI to help us surface better decisions. So if I can give an example, one of my favourite examples of this is a number of years ago there was a credit card study that was done and around Australians, and it looked at how Australians were getting benefits from credit cards. And 40% of Australians basically were getting a net benefit from the credit cards that they had. 30% were not getting a net benefit or a net negative, so there was just nothing. And then there was 30% getting a negative outcome from the credit cards. Now, that wasn't because they were being misled. It's because, of course, we as consumers, we jump on and we think that we're going to save more than we do or pay off more of our credit card, and we want the fancy card or whatever that might be, right? So now companies can surface that and they can showcase the cards that would be best for you, or over a period of time, let you be human and make your mistakes, but come back and then help you learn along the way. And that to me is really incredible piece now is that we can surface where you're getting benefits from products and where you're not, and when companies are doing sort of the right things as well as misleading. So I feel like that is a really key piece that we can now tap into when it comes to technology, is there's another level of accountability. The one piece I'd say just quickly around trust though is, and trustworthiness then is, what do we find is trustworthy? And I think in leadership what you usually see is it's like authenticity. So what I mean by that is, in order for us to experiment, we have to make mistakes. And in companies are now doing that, where they're trying to understand that they're becoming more experimental in their mindset, in my view, because of course they're going to have to test a lot of this technology. And engineers often say the best year to be in AI was last month. And it's a terrible joke, but it's a joke around the fact that it's moving so fast. And so how do we help the progression in a way that prevents negative impacts, but also helps that when failures occur, they can pivot and shift, and they can be more human, even as companies, when we're moving into a world that is we don't really have the rules for like we used to.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that leadership is the greatest public good that there is. And, if you want a good, successful country, you need high-quality leadership, or company, or anything else, maybe even household. Okay, let's turn to Q&A. I think we've got about 10 minutes or so to be able to do so. We do have a roving mic on the Q&A, so please just pause until the mic comes to you. And these are recorded. Martin, you're starting off.
Thanks. Great presentation, David, and great conversation, folks. But this issue of trust has real implications for policy design. I want to take you back to the NDIS, so National Disability Insurance Scheme. I think you've got a fundamental problem. People no longer believe in the beneficent intent of government. That is, they don't believe that the victors of the world, when they're elected, actually have any interest in serving their interests, addressing their concerns, nor do they think the Martin Parkinsons who are working with the victors have any interest. Could be a fair point.
That's both wrong on both times, but anyway.
Could be a fair point. But they also doubt our competence. And that's because we've talked a lot about market failure, but we stopped talking about government failure. Classic example where we ran into this problem was when we started the NDIS, we deliberately set about running trials in different parts of the country to try different delivery mechanisms and different types of interventions with the view we're going to run this for, I can't remember, but it's like 12 months, 2 years. We were then going to take that back into the program and design something that was going to be better for everybody. It lasted a matter of months because people in one area were saying, I'm not getting what they're getting over there. And the political class collapsed in face of that criticism from the voters. And so now we end up with what is arguably a dramatically failing system, because all of those opportunities to test and trial weren't acceptable to the polity. So coming back to this questions that we've been discussing, it's great that we're able to do these things. How do we get the community to be willing to come along with government or with companies and that, so they can do things and fail fast if they need to?
David, over to you.
Yeah, well, some may know when I was in British government, I spent nearly a decade alongside my day job as National What Works advisor, and I always thought the secret sauce of behavioural science, as we were applying, was empiricism. And the history would judge that was a really useful thing. And of course, you had Peter here, as you know well, and I still think that's true. I think it is astonishing. With respect to the performance of government, government can't make anywhere close to the sort of the advertising claim of we know 50% of it worked, we just don't know which 50%. If only we knew 50% of it worked. We are so far beyond it. It's breathtakingly off the mark. And it is a really deep, interesting question. Like most people just often use the example, when you go to your doctor, you kind of expect them, before they recommend a treatment, it's been tested, right? Of course it has. And yet, when you get to other domains, be it what's happening in your school or in a criminal justice system or a welfare system, we don't appear to demand the same. People do seem to intuit it. If you do it with kids, you can give them a little test and they like, actually, where's my control group, etc. But it's really, why are we not able to win that argument? And I think, myself, I actually think partly it's the competence of a system of designing it. Well, like, if you really know it's not going to work, but if there's real doubt, then why wouldn't we test variations? I'm also, I'm a big believer in, if you involve citizens much more and say, what do we not know? There are lots of versions of this program. Which one works best for you guys? We don't know the answer. Guess what they say is, well, why wouldn't you try them out, right? Yeah. So I think it is possible. And just one note of positivity, right, is if you take Pippa Norris's work on trust in government, etc., there is a pretty damn strong relationship, at least in Western democracies have functioning media, etc., between the performance of government objectively and trust. So, partly going by earlier remarks, my view is, and you may or may not share it, which is that there are a number of domains we don't test stuff properly, we don't do it competently, and even on things like economic growth. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm trying to give you a list of things where I think there are major levers which we could do which would lift growth and particularly help some of the most disadvantaged, as it happens, and we're not using them. Well, citizens have a right to be really annoyed. We're following bullshit theories which need updating, and we haven't been daring enough to try out some alternative models, right? So, back up a bit. We need to do better, right?
Yeah, it comes back very much to Marosh's point earlier on of his experience with the experimental lab. If we're only getting 40% of the a priori expectations right, it just shows how we have to have a dialogue with the people to say, you know what, we're not ready to do this. Otherwise, we end up with failed programs that go from there. Question at the very back.
Hi, thank you. My name's Cressida Gorkroja. I work with governments on how to build in long-term thinking into policy decision-making, which is unfortunately something we're not uniformly very good at. One of the examples that I bring up as a really good way of taking a step towards shifting to better long-term decision-making is the Services New South Wales example. Why? Because Services New South Wales is often the main, if not the only time when people interact with government. And when that is a smooth system, it might feel like a really small thing, but that is actually really key to building trust. And you need to have really strong trust in government in order to be able to bring in those kinds of long-term policies that often have high upfront costs, but lower costs over the lifespan of the policy, or that take a preventative approach where you only get to see the results in 4, 10, 20 years' time. And I was just interested in getting your thoughts on how you can expand this kind of model to do not just individual policies, but actually think about different ways in which we can change policy interventions across the board. So we talk about governments not having enough information often and needing to do this kind of research to know how people are going to respond. Often governments know exactly the right thing to do.
Let me pause there and turn over to the panel. Victor, how many experiments did you run as you thought about the change in Service New South Wales and what you were going to have to do? And all
countless. Even just the driver's licence alone, we did about five or six pilots.
Wow.
And even then, right towards the end, the most powerful thing with the pilots was getting real-time feedback. Yeah. Because people were telling us this is not working, this is working, and moreover we were displaying that feedback publicly, so we were showing it back. So again, if we were redesigning government into a government 3.0, let alone a 4.0, you'd have the ACCC demanding that every time, and I insisted on it inside New South Wales, if there was a new digital service that we were rolling out, I want real-time feedback.
Yeah.
And we're going to publish it. And, for example, we got to the driver's licence, we were getting feedback scores of 92, 93, 94 for a government service. It's insane. But we did the same, and it's all on a dashboard. You can still see it now, thank God. And we did the same with the boating licence or fishing licences. And I think that had a score of 45%. But the point is, it's transparent.
Yes.
Now, people might say, that's good, that's bad. But the fact that we made it transparent builds trust. Because if I'm doing this and I can see that coming back to me, I'll say, fix it up, but at least you're acknowledging it. And when the media would crucify me over it, I'll say, yep, we've got to do better on that. I'm going to keep talking about this one. Yeah. We've got to do better on that. But I think that transparency and getting the institution and giving them more power to say, oh, hold it, why are we not getting real-time feedback in relation to hospital wait times? Because we don't like the answer.
Yep.
Well, we'll put the answer up and then we'll put some more sunlight on it and then the politicians will give it a bit more attention.
Yeah.
You might improve the score.
I spoke at the beginning about how important it was getting the incentives of the stakeholders aligned to the goal. And I think having the boss wanting real-time information is the best incentive of the lot. It comes back very much to that quality leadership question. Okay, I'll take two more questions. Yep, one at the back.
Hello, my name is Bhuvan Avasthi. I'm a behavioral scientist with the Canadian government. I have a question specifically regarding the digital government space in the context of AI. Do you see a possibility of audit of the algorithms from a behavioral perspective so that there's a consumer protection possibility?
Oh, without a doubt. I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen. Again, I can't even imagine where the world's going to be in 5, let alone 10 years, particularly in the agentic era, and consumers are going to be demanding it. But how are we going to do it? Are we going to do it haphazardly, or are we going to strengthen institutions? So I really think that for Government 3.0, we need to start reimagining what our institutions look like, and they need to have a lot more teeth moving into this next era, and including to demand these things. Or are we just going to say, oh, well, look, we'll give it to the Auditor General, or we'll give it to the Ombudsman? There needs to be a more coordinated approach to this, and I think it needs to, again, the architecture needs to come from the top.
And building trust from the top
100%.
is going to be
And this is
absolutely 100%. And
this
the
is a
open
trust
dialogue
play.
that Martin was talking about is just so essential.
Building these institutions is a trust play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last question, any from there? Just the lady here.
Hi there, Dr. Cecilia here. Full disclosure, I'm a behavioural scientist, so I've got a bit of a bias there, of course. And the reason why I love behavioural science and behavioural scientists is demonstrated here. Evidence-based thinking, the joy of being wrong, well, wrong 60% of the time, and that real joy of evidence-based thinking. One thing I have noticed, we're working in this space, is when we talk about moving consumers, citizens, employees, nudging them, boosting them towards certain outcomes or certain goals. The question is, whose goals, whose outcomes, and what are we serving? So that's where a lot of people start to get the ick with behavioural science, because it can be used as a tool for power. It can be used as a tool for bettering the goals or the outcomes of people that may not have me as a consumer, as a citizen, as an employee, my best interests in mind, but instead how I can serve their goals or their best interests. And it doesn't always happen, but I do think that's where a lot of the trust is, and particularly the trust of behavioural science. So I guess, like, how do we as practitioners in this space, either labelled practitioners or just general people who use evidence-based thinking and observations as humans to inform our decision-making, how do we make sure that we stay on that side, that right side of that, and the ethical space where we're actually centering the experiences and the outcomes for the people that we're serving, not necessarily, because we've talked a lot about governments, businesses, but we haven't talked of making these decisions, but not necessarily a lot around whose goals we're serving and why. It's an assumption, but how do we stay in that space and not blur those boundaries so that we can maintain that trust and earn it?
So I'm going to give the last word to David, our speaker, who's come out to say this issue obviously about doesn't this open up a wide range of manipulation? And in fact, aren't we already seeing that in not necessarily this space, but in a broader space of the public dialogue? And does this give the keys to the people that can do bad things with it?
Well, for sure it does. I mean, it's like any form of knowledge. You can use it for good or bad. You mentioned gambling. I mean, gambling in a certain way is a kind of genius of behavioural science. You've kind of, if you're a behavioural scientist, you've got to admire the genius of, near misses. The Vegas casino is a masterpiece of behavioural science in terms of remove cues of the environment, continually hear someone winning in the room, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? Of course, governments can use it for good or for bad, and we hope we've got good governments who will use it for good. So one of the defense, Cass and Richard in the US particularly would use the line around libertarian paternalism, is that it's considered, it leaves the choice on the table, right, is the argument. So if we put the salad first in the canteen, the favorite example, people fill up their plates relatively rapidly and they'll put more salad and so on. If you really don't want the salad, you can walk on by and the chips are still there, right? So in that sense, it's often seen, it's at least choice enhancing or continuing. I've never thought that was an adequate or fully adequate response, which is why I go back to the original statement when we were setting up the Behavioural Insight team, which was, can we support people to make better choices for themselves, right? Can we design institutions to enable them to do that? And there are lots of players. I mean, AI, you talked about lots of time. If you read the Sam Altman interview in the FT a little while, quite a few months ago now, and it was done in his kitchen and everybody was looking at it. There was a coffee machine in the back. It was a really expensive coffee machine. It was the one at that time which was recommended on, the relevant AI. But coffee experts said it's not a very good coffee maker. It's overpriced and blah, 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 right? Well, why is it recommending it? I mean, for sure that's going to happen pretty soon. On what basis is it recommending it? And just why I feel like, are humans good at judging? We're actually not that good at judging whether other people are lying and so on. It's an interesting thing. We're prone to assume trust. What are our institutions to make sure that these things stay clean? That's my point about the races, right? That is what we absolutely can and should do. We've been behind the curve on social media where you end up with bans. We're fascinated about that. Like, are we going to do that with respect to, is it a trustworthy product giving you good advice or is it not? We actually don't have to unpack the whole algorithm, but we need to be clear about what we want from these things and to inform people make better choices. That is a pretty good place to go.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of, I'm going to close the session. I just wanted to say that the difficulty thing is that you can't ask AI to do something it just simply can't do. And the idea of being able to go back and show you in kind of an econometric-like sort of thing, this was the weight I put on this variable and this was the weight I put on this. This is not what it does. So it's going to be really challenging to think about how we take decisions that are created in ways that we don't understand and yet want in order to design a better society. But that's a problem for another day. I want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank Martin and Leonie for organising this at relatively short notice. Thank you so much for going on and going there. Kush, obviously, and your team for putting it all together, but especially also the panel, including David, who's come out here, Victor, Juliette, and Maroš. Can we give them all a hand of applause?